So, with everything that's happening and much of it unexpected, it can feel too chaotic to deal with. But sometimes the chaos is good and amazing. Sure, some of it is like my poor kiddo who got to do their high school graduation in weird COVID times, is now graduating into a job market full of exploding assumptions. But then there's other things, like how a few of my own assumptions have been disintegrated in other ways. I mean, the Romania I knew in the 20th century as an impenetrable, unvisitable fortress ended up being a travel destination, and it was absolutely captivating. I even did a bonus episode about it. Another thing I never bothered thinking about, would I ever be associated with something nominated for an Emmy? I mean, if you'd asked me up until very recently, my reply would have been, well, no, I'm a science educator type person with cooking and fiber art tendencies and an affection for history. Turns out, wrong again, and definitely in the fun way. The Female Farmer Project, which has taken me all sorts of interesting places, has been rolling along for over a decade. I've done research, cheerleading, and tying together loose threads. So imagine my surprise when Audra Mulkern, the brains of the operation and the creative engine of the whole thing, informs me that Women's Work, the untold story of America's female farmers, has been nominated for an Emmy. Stop! Now, if you're curious what all the hullabaloo is about, you can watch the documentary through your local PBS affiliate. I'll have a link to both the documentary and the Emmy nomination in the show notes. As crazed as everything is right now, I can't help but be a little Sound of Music about it all. When a door closes, there's a window opening somewhere. I mean, Maria's plans for a nice, predictable, bounded career were blown up, and she had a fascist regime trying to get cozy around her. And yet, some things came out very differently, but she was working at what she figured out she was good at. In a time when there are no clear, just do this thing paths to success right now, it's earthquakes happening to our expectations everywhere. It's nice when some of the earthquakes are good surprises. So with that said, reach into things that interest you with people who are doing cool things to make the world better for more people. And in my case, watch women helping the earth grow good food in all manner of ways in Women's Work, the untold story of America's female farmers by Audra Mulkern and Kara Rowe. And there I am as a producer. If you do look it up, you'll keep scrolling till you get to programming content, documentary, cultural, and historical. But we are Emmy nominated, and I am continuously amazed. Thanks for letting me be part of it, Audra. Episode 165. Is this enough food to feed an army? And what were they thinking? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at, given how armies had fed themselves in the past, how was the new tech starting to come into play in 1860s America? I'll also spend some time looking at how competing infrastructure contributed to the way each side could be fed. To find out how food was basically a munition in the American Civil War and how much the scale caught some people off guard, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the tendency to underestimate how long a war will take seems to be a perpetual problem. The repeated misplaced confidence that all you have to do to win is show up with an awesome plan and either overwhelming or surprise force, and it'll all be over quickly, is something that has not worked from Hannibal invading Rome from Carthage all the way up to today. And the war plans for the American Civil War were no different. Maybe they were a little better with the actual battle plans, but as far as the planning for provisioning the troops and providing food to aid stations and hospitals, they were way off. Both sides were way off. And there was no reason they should have been. The last several large conflicts America had taken part in, or had sent observers to, had been lengthy. The War of 1812 with the British had lasted until 1815. The Napoleonic Wars had rolled around Europe from 1803 through 1815. The much more recent conflict of the Crimean War had dragged on from 1853 through 1856. And while the first two conflicts had been fought in a pretty traditional 18th century style, with smallish mobile armies roving from battle site to battle site so as not to deplete the countryside and starve, march to Moscow very much accepted, the Crimean War had been something different. The Crimean War was another chapter in the long history of the choke point that is the strait that divides the Black Sea from the Mediterranean, and is the forever point of irritation between Turkey and Russia, or whatever they're calling themselves at the time. This more or less eternal divider of what is Asia and what is Europe has been a point of contention since people have been making boats, and possibly longer. I mean, Crimea is even in the news right now. The other thing that's important to know is that when big wars happened around the world in this age, people from other countries would come and watch, largely with a desire to see what's up in war now, and for that purpose, the Crimean War was a doozy. First, it was an unusually large conflict for the age. There were around 1.5 million combatants on both sides, and about 500,000 of them died, most due to disease and malnourishment rather than directly from wounds, which was a common thread in all military conflicts of this age if you're keeping score at home. Anyway, the Crimean War had everyone taking notes, as it included the use of a bunch of new technology. They used telegraphs to send messages. That's right, electricity and wires come to war. There was also trench warfare, and the arrival of steam engines meant there were amphibious assaults, and the fact that soldiers had done away with metal breastplates or cuirasses helped with this as well, because you weren't wearing a literal metal weight strapped to your body as you tried to wade ashore from the boat. The fact that contemporary bullets punched through the breastplates also led to their demise. And this was the Minié bullet, the first large production pointy-ended or bullet-shaped bullet, rather than a round ball, contributed to new rules in warfare. These worked with a rifled barrel, which let the ammunition fly further. They also loaded from the back or breech end rather than from the front, so they were much faster to shoot. This Minié ball, or mini ball as it came to be known in the US, also inflicted much more devastating wounds. These larger armies getting shot with more bullets that were more destructive created the need for an amount of hospital services no one seemed to have seen coming. As a result, food for an enormous hospital absolutely caught headquarters staff off guard, which is where Florence Nightingale steps into the story. She was able to throw elbows and point out that a bunch of sick guys need food and care, or they will end up all being a bunch of dead guys. Alexis Soyer, my new favorite food celebrity of the past, also pointed out that you have to feed the fighting guys better, or they too will end up being dead guys. While the Turkish army and the French armies had something along the lines of kitchens and bread ovens and cooks, the British were the mess cooks for itself, which meant each group of 8 to maybe 20 guys were expected to fend for themselves. To be fair, when this was all getting going, the growing railroad network of Europe had been leveraged to get guys to the site of the battle and to get food to them as well. And this worked fine and all until the railroad supplied food depots were 19 kilometers or about 10 miles away from where all the soldiers were, and the supply wagon rotation went down because of, the donkey problem. The fodder for the wagon-pulling animals ran out, so the soldiers were walking 38 kilometers round trip to pick up supplies in the mud and the rain and the snow. A quick apology and an aside, while the donkey problem is referenced by maximum reward, minimum effort, and that's where the equations reside, it comes originally from another pedantic in the Funway blog, acoop.blog. That is, a collection of unmitigated pedantry. I've mentioned it before, and it combines escapism with competency #goals. Yes, there's a link in the show notes, and in case you think they are lost in the past, Acoup blog are also willing to go into the far future and address fantasy, in this case particularly to dissect the logistics problem of warfare on Dune. Farfoluchus and everything. This extended aside is my way of apologizing for forgetting the original source and encouraging you to take a peek at Acoup blog. Anyway, when these guys in the Crimea were getting the food, because they were staying in the same spot for a long time, and there were a lot of them, the traditional fuel of the soldier in the field, wood, it was running out. And to make it worse, if you have 10,000 campfires feeding 80,000 guys, you better believe this is not an efficient way to make food. Add in that almost all of the guys cooking the food are very bad at it, things get worse. Alexis Soyer, a man of apparently boundless energy, stepped into the fray with the design of a compact stove that could burn both wood or coal, or even work with some of the fuel gases in development at the time. As a restaurant chef and a guy who liked designing meals for ludicrously large royal entertainments, he had better insight into what I call the bigness problem when it came to feeding people that the army staff simply did not. Having each mess cook for themselves, especially when all of them were likely bad or untrained cooks, because cooking took training and skill, was inefficient both with the food they were issued and the fuel they had access to. Setting up camp kitchens to feed large numbers of men was a much better solution. Soyer didn't have time to train up a brigade of cooks. Instead, he bulled his way into the army with a few cooks and told them to assign him some soldiers who could follow directions. Between Nightingale and Soyer, far fewer British soldiers died of malnutrition and related complications than could have. Sure, the British, French, and Turkish side won over the Russian alliance, and the Russians once again were kicked out of their only year-round ice-free port. But the result was fragile and the errors of leadership were legion. But making sure that the right lessons were not learned was Alfred Lord Tennyson and his catchy verse, The Charge of the Light Brigade. This was a poem about a cool-looking but incredibly dumb sortie by a bunch of British dudes on expensive horses in blingy uniforms. And I have a link to the whole thing at the end. But there were a gajillion people who totally loved the poem, but mostly only memorized the opening. This is the one that says, "There's not to reason why, there's not to make reply, there's but to do and die." There's a certain type of person who loves it. Then there's also the part that says, "Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, that they had struck so well, rode through the jaws of death." And the people who memorize and love this part seem to forget that 2/3 of the company were killed or otherwise taken out of the fight, and oh yeah, they absolutely failed at the objective of capturing some artillery, which had been the point of the whole thing in the first place. The Crimean War was one of the first widely photographed wars, and that fact, along with steamships and trains, meant that travel was faster and easier. So far more official observers from other countries and reporters were there, and they helped spread some of the first photographs of war, and those were often backed by gushy lines about the glory of war, epitomized by Tennyson's catchy ditty. The end result? It caused people to spend time thinking about how cool war seems. Nifty uniforms, big booms, but neglected the parts no one wants to think about, the noise, the stink, and where a guy is going to get his dinner. Never mind a bath. And so it was, this most recent of big wars was in the mind of the U.S. Army. Armies? And what they were thinking of as they planned for war. They, too, had access to telegraphs, to trains, to steamships, and to the mini-ball. Part of the issue is that the last several conflicts the U.S. had fought had been extremely asymmetrical. So they didn't think about this war as between two teams fighting with basically all the same stuff. In the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812, there were hard caps on how many guys the British could supply, and it took a long time for them to get more bullets and more powder and more orders. And the Americans had maps and local knowledge that were way better as well. And when America had gone adventuring in Mexico, they usually showed up, did a thing, declared victory, or at least were done, and departed. The wars the U.S. Army was fighting with the tribes in the Midwest, on the prairies, and in the canyons were messy, sure, but generally the U.S. Army had guns and the other side didn't so much. And even more importantly, the locals were having their food supplies destroyed while the Army was getting shipments of food. The tribes were trying to make food and defend their homes, while all the Army had to do was make war. Here, the U.S. Army would learn a few things about how food was a useful weapon in a sloggy conflict, as the U.S. Civil War was about to become. So here we are, contemporary, it's Civil War time. War is declared. Both sides initially figure that, yes, there will be war. But how long can it last, really? No one wants to fight in a long, drawn-out slog. The Union figured with the next growing season coming up, the Confederacy would give up in favor of making money and just, sort out a different way to do things. The Confeds, on the other hand, figured that the Union would simply fight them for, some time to satisfy honor. But once they did that, it's treaty time, and then they could just go back to, trading, and stuff would be the same. Both sides were wrong. Yes, there's more to it than this, but we have the main themes and errors. Because of these misguided plans, neither side had done much to deal with the supply problem. As I've repeatedly said, America's Army was used to playing in the thousands, or maybe the tens of thousands league. Despite having observers in the Crimea, they didn't really consider the hundreds of thousands league. Many of this Army staff were also pretty spiritually Victorian, and that means they were all reading Hannibal's Adventures in Rome. And yet somehow they kept taking all the wrong lessons. They loved the part with the elephants and the double envelopment at Cannae, but the thing people planning the war did not learn is that do what you will, people are real stubborn about things when it involves messing up their home life. I have long felt that this is the important lesson everyone misses about the Punic Wars, the ones between Rome and Carthage. Doesn't matter how much bigger and better equipped your army is. What you're doing is rolling into a place and telling the home team to knock it off. It won't work. It may work for a little while, but yelling at people in military, don't do that thing because I said so. Well, no, I don't live here. Why do you ask? This has a multi-millennial track record of failing. I watched it personally as a kid in Southeastern Europe, in countries around the Persian Gulf, and in Central America. Showing up with guns and giving money to people who are already powerful seems to never cause things to change. Anyway, so the Union Army didn't plan for stubbornness, and neither did the Confed side. So there wasn't enough food for the whole war, but there was enough to start one. So what were they doing at the beginning? Well, there were concerted efforts to create army-sized supplies for that first rush of conflict. But soon the year ended, and that year's food was done. But the war was still there, and if you remember from last episode, at this point, for the most part, food stocks are for about a year. Stockpiled stuff is limited, and fresh produce, as military rations, were pretty much not a thing. The war started in April, which is great from a food standpoint. The planting is done, and now it's growing time. Things wrap up in September-ish, and we can work on planning for harvest and storage. That's not, of course, what happened. The Union states were more affected at this point because more of their agricultural workers were involved in the war. But because Europe was suffering and slowly recovering from a combination of famines caused by weather, waves of revolution, and crappy profiteering, there was an influx of people willing to take jobs on farms and do the agricultural work or take up arms to earn a place in the country. Yes, as the war goes on, all manner of immigrants, but especially Irish and German ones, will arrive in New York or Boston, get off the boat, be handed a gun and a uniform, and be told if you want your family to be admitted, you're going to have to serve. Welcome to America. Now, if you were a state involved in war and come harvest time, you can see that this is not going to end by Christmas. Honestly, lots of people thought Christmas would be the end. I mean, who wants a war at Christmas? But since you know it's not going to end by Christmas, how would you plan next year's planting? How about switching your non-food crops and other export materials to food crops? That would be a good thing to do, right? Well, no. The southeastern states, where the largest plantations were, built specifically in places for their amazing soil fertility, because they were growing notoriously hungry crops like cotton and rice and sugar. They did not come together and say, folks, if we're going to get through this, we're going to have to grow food. Because they were in a hole. Sure, in the 1700s, many of these plantations had been more or less self-sufficient, and as a result, were earning modest profits on what they exported. But by the early 19th century, especially with the presence of steam engines and riverboats and railroads, the hunger for more cash faster had taken over. The same way the sugar islands in the Caribbean had stopped producing their food, or as little as they could get away with, the southern plantations had gone the same way. The rice, sugar, indigo, and cotton-producing regions of the American Southeast were dependent on cattle drives from Texas and western Louisiana. They needed pig drives from the Appalachian regions, and they required imports of wheat from Pennsylvania. Back home, they were just hand-cracking corn and hand-pounding rice and hand-hammering iron instead of investing in grain mills and metal rolling mills and wire-pulling technology. These people had invested money in purchasing human labor. As a result, they were so tied to it that they refused to invest in technologies that would, they feared, destroy the systems they had built their fortunes on. New technology, they figured, would devalue their investments. This same rigid defense of how the world worked meant that even with another year of war looming, they were still unwilling to take a hit in the production of their export products. Though they easily could have produced plenty of corn and livestock, sweet potatoes and squash to see them through, they did not increase food production. They placed all their faith in retaining trade relationships with England and continuing to sell their exports and purchase what they had always bought. This future of the Confederate States project would not mess up their production plans. Meanwhile, in the Union States, they kept planting food, especially wheat, out in the new and expanding plains. And after some early stumbles, started working on organizing hard bread, that is, hardtack production. They partnered with metal canning manufacturers like Van Camp and Borden and many other smaller ones. They came up with desiccated vegetables, which, while exorable, were literally better than nothing. Both sides of the conflict were faced with similar bigness problems. Compared to trumping across Europe in the 19th century, mid-19th century America is enormous, especially when you look at the distance from Georgia to Maine. I mean, sure, Holland to Spain is about the same distance, but no one's expecting you to supply an army in Spain with Dutch cheese. But getting salt cod from Maine to Savannah, Georgia, or at least Richmond, Virginia, was what people were planning on doing in the American Civil War. And this is where it's not just the food growing decisions that would come to bite the southern states when it came to supplying food to soldiers for the war. By the 1860s, the Northeast and what counted as the Northwest then was pretty gridded with railroads. Chicago was a center point for the expanding westward and south. Everyone with a cow and many with pigs were able to load them onto trains and get them to Chicago, where they could be slaughtered, salted, and barreled. You could bring salt from the ports, barrel staves from the forest, and iron hoops from the ironworks in Pennsylvania, all together. The Northeast had bought very hard into Adam Smith's ideas. They were taking a swing at early-stage capitalism. They decided to go in for doing one thing well regionally and moving goods and money as fast as they could. The Southeast, on the other hand, still held doggedly onto the ideals of mercantilism. Many people in power said, I will be as self-sufficient as I can and try to get everybody else's silver while hoarding as much of my own as I might. As a result, while railroads were built to benefit everyone's commerce in the northern states, it was much more common in the southeast for plantations to have their own personal docks on rivers where they did their own trades, or maybe build a few lines that went from collection points for cotton or rice and such out to a larger port. Using this new transportation technology to stimulate internal trade was never seen as important. The idea of the Confederate States pulling together for a war effort was pretty antithetical to their whole plan. Many were thinking, I'm doing this so no one can tell me what to do, and so messing up their planting schedules for the year's planned output of trade goods was never considered. I'll be fine until the war is over, is something many a plantation owner said. There's no reason for any war to come to me, so why should I contribute to this war effort? Smallholders and homesteaders, who often ended up doing a lot of the fighting, may have had different thoughts, but they weren't the ones pulling the levers of power. And on one hand, it was true for many estates that they were nowhere near where the war was likely to go. Many an estate might be large and have glass windows, a lovely piano, and an enviable buttery, and productive brandy stills. And traveling to one of these estates in its lonely splendor was something of an expedition. The roads were bad and only traveled a few times a year to do things like get the year's pig drive or maybe go to a legislative session or a family wedding. Many places thought their isolation would keep them safe. And so the result was, as the war went on, while the Union had to scramble and do things like the potato fleet, the existing infrastructure of trains and steamboats meant they were able to. The Confederate Army, supplied by these fierce individualists unwilling to come together for a common cause, found that they were faced with privation and then starvation much faster. In the early stages of, this is going to be a longer war, many of the soldiers on both sides resorted to the foraging and thievery that went along with any war of this age. And for a while, that would work. But as the farms on the march were depleted, especially as the residents were killed or abandoned their homes, it didn't work so well. Also, while a large number of the soldiers were farm kids and had done some foraging, plenty of them, in a combination of hunger and ignorance, were gathering up plants that were somewhere between mildly toxic to downright poisonous. I mean, after all, the plants in South Carolina look different from the good stuff in Massachusetts or even Ireland. Many a commander had to forbid the foraging of wild plants as it was contributing to too many casualties on the trail. In the end, what really put paid to early foraging was that when you start marching tens of thousands of soldiers repeatedly over the same terrain, the farms give out, the foraging is wiped out, and hunting for game is no longer possible. The deer are gone, so are the possums, even the birds and squirrels. So as the war entered into its second and then third years, the military staff on both sides, charged with supply, saw that they were overmatched. They had all come from military planning in a U.S. Army, where troops and planning supply had always been measured in thousands. Remember, the largest battle in the Revolutionary War topped out at 30,000 guys combined on both sides, and the Americans had to borrow 7,000 French guys to pull that off. Now, they found themselves having to supply for hundreds of thousands of guys. The old way of just like piles of barrels of salt pork and cornmeal and wheat flour, and then filling in the cracks with apples and pumpkins and loose chickens from the countryside and cheese and raisins and tea from the traveling settlers, wasn't going to fill in all the gaps. The Union side had a bigger landscape to supply from and more trains to move said supplies. They had better chances, but when it came to making food in the field work, both sides were working with the every mess cooks for itself plan that had almost starved the British troops at Sebastopol and Balaclava in the Crimea. And as wood and water and food supplies were dwindling, and both sides were overwhelmed with just how many guys they were responsible for feeding, just like in the Crimea, they turned to the people who had been managing food service on a large scale for the longest. And in this case, it was the women. Tune in next week to hear about how women showed up on both sides, wooden spoons in hand, and whipped the field kitchen situation into shape, or at least as much of a shape as contemporary supplies would allow. How women like Annie T. Wittenmeyer and Mary Ann Bickerdike followed the path blazed by Florence Nightingale. They were part of the regiment of women who reformed hospital food when it became evident that these new bullets, the mini ball, meant If you didn't want all of your injured guys to become dead guys, and if you didn't want the rest of your other guys to be starved to death, well, something was going to have to be done. Thanks for listening. And spread the word of this podcast by words out of your own mouth to your food and history curious friends. Also, do please leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. I really appreciate it. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Insta as @THOAFood. And all of this information, including the promised links, are available in the show description.